Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Megan Donaldson, and I'm the Alumni Relations Manager here at Trinity Development and Alumni. It's great to have you here with us today for the latest episode in our Inspiring Ideas at Trinity series, titled Age Proof, the New Science of Living a Longer and Healthier Life. We are delighted to welcome today's speaker, Professor Roseanne Kenny, for what I'm sure will be a fascinating insight into how we can all start living fitter, healthier, and happier lives. Our webinar today will be just under 1 hour. The talk itself will last around 30 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to audience questions at the end of the discussion. Please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and we certainly encourage as much audience interaction as possible. You're welcome to pop in the questions as you think of them throughout the talk. I'd like to note that we are using Zoom-generated automatic subtitles for this webinar. If you'd like to turn these subtitles on or off, please click the CC Closed Captions button at the bottom of your screen, then click Show or Hide Subtitles. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our alumni YouTube channel. Now, many of you will be familiar with Professor Kenny and her work on aging, and may even have already picked up a copy of her new book, also titled Age Proof. But those of you who are encountering her for the first time today, she's an award-winning physician and researcher who has been head of the Academic Department of Medical Gerontology at Trinity College Dublin since 2006. She is also the founding principal investigator of the Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging, also known as TILDA. Professor Kenny has published over 600 scientific publications to date, and earlier this year published her latest book, Age Proof. It is now my pleasure to hand you over to Professor Kenny.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for this kind invitation. Delighted to speak to our alumni on this important topic. And I suppose if any of you are in a hurry or a rush and you would like a bottom line, my bottom line is the earlier, the better, and it's never too late. No harm to reflect back on what the big changes are demographically, challenging our world at present and into the future in the context of demography. Since as early as accurate records were kept in the 1800s, there has been a linear increase in life expectancy from 40 in 1800 up to 85 today and beyond. So that during the last 200 years, human life expectancy has effectively doubled in developed countries. That's an increase every decade of 2.5 decades, of 2.5 years. And translating that into absolute numbers, at the moment, there are 617 million people over the age of 65. But by 2025, that's not that long away, 3 years' time, there'll be 1 billion, 12% of the total world population. Of course, this is brilliant. This is to be celebrated. But what all of us would wish for, I think, is not just longer lifespan, which is pretty much inevitable for the majority of us, but rather longer, healthier lifespan. And a sobering figure is the fact that we will spend 1/5 of our lives with some degree of disability, be it arthritis, be it high blood pressure, for some of us strokes, for some of us heart disease, for some of us dementia, etc. 1/5. So our purpose as researchers and as a university is to see how we can best compress that period of disability, mostly at the end of life, so that we have not just extended lifespan, but healthy extended lifespan. The Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging, which has 8,500 participants over the age of 50, who are reassessed every 2 years and is now in its 12th year of follow-up is a very valuable source of information for a lot of what I'm going to share with you. And for the international literature on this as well. I want to emphasize that the study was funded initially over 12 years ago now by the Department of Health and Atlantic Philanthropies, but in particular by a philanthropic gift, which was the first gift to the study to get it kickstarted from Irish Life. And that award hugely helped us to leverage government and other funding to support the study. The study is now the best source of adult data in Ireland to inform policy, innovation, and research. And we've accrued, as a result of that initial funding and continued funding, further funding from recognised funding sources for research, not only in Ireland, but the States and Europe. So what do we look at? We try to unpack the experience of aging using data from genes, nutrition, family networks, friendships, education, economics, mental health, physical health, so that we can put the whole tapestry of aging together. And what we do is we follow people at the inception of the study every 2 years to try and understand the process of aging. So say somebody came into the study at age 50 and it's a randomly selected sample. People didn't come to us saying, I'd like to take part, please. We approached people in Ireland inviting them to take part in this study and followed them every 2 years. And at age 50, if we pick up certain biomarkers, certain changes, and track someone through, we can see which ones actually predicted the fact that that person in 12 years' time was going to get cognitive impairment, or a stroke, or a heart attack, or depression, etc. So that's the value of a longitudinal study design. And the study has been developed in such a way that it's harmonized with other international studies. We've done a lot, therefore, of international collaboration, and it's harmonized in such a way, not just for comparability, but to compare with policy elsewhere and inform Irish policy, as well as novel research. I'm going to share some of the novel research with you now. Now, I love the fact that your attitude, one's attitude, can actually influence one's biology, how one ages biologically. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by this. This is a movie from the 1950s, where the principal character, Monty Woolley, was compulsory, made redundant at age 65. He was unpleased with this. He felt he had an awful lot to give back to the company. So he dyed his hair black and returned to the company in the guise of the company president. And during the tour of the factory by very nervous officials who had previously been his work colleagues, he commented how few older persons were working in the workforce and how much value and intellectual history and knowledge they can bring to an environment. So that policy was changed. He was discovered, but he had made such a turnaround in the company and stocks and shares had risen so high that he was offered another permanent job, which he declined. He had made his point. I'm making that point in the context of compulsory retirement and attitudes, societal attitudes towards people as we get older. And I'm going to translate that into a lovely experiment from the Levi's group in Yale. She took 2 groups of students, psychology students, and did baseline mood assessments and stress assessments like blood pressure, heart rate, neurohormones like cortisol, etc. So she had all of those measured baseline in her class. And then she divided her class into 2 groups. The first group were exposed to words, positive words, if you like accomplished, enlightened, guidance, alert, astute, sage, advised, creative, improving, insightful, learned. The second group, who had been separated from the first, were exposed to words like Alzheimer's, confused, decline, decrepit, dementia, dependent, diseases, dying, forgets, incompetent, misplaces, senile. And then she exposed them to a stress test, like a mental stress test. And again measured their blood pressure, their heart rate, their skin blood flow, which is a measure of sympathetic function, and blood tests, hormone tests, particularly cortisols. And she found that the students who had been exposed to the negative stereotypes, the latter, displayed less ability to mitigate the stress responses. They had much higher stress responses in all of the physiological and hormonal components. Conversely, those who had been exposed just to the words, the positive stereotypes, were better able to mitigate the stress responses. So the bottom line is that attitudes enable us with an ability to manage stress if we have positive attitudes and impact well, ultimately, on repeated chronic stressors. Attitude matters. This is work that was done by our own group, Deirdre Robertson's PhD. And look at the following 4 items that she looked at. I have no control over how getting old affects my social life. As I get older, I can take part in fewer activities. As I get older, I get wiser. As I get older, there is much I can do to maintain my independence. Now you can see the first 2 are kind of negative and the second 2 are positive. Terribly simple statements. They're just examples of a menu of statements. She found when she checked walking speed, memory, concentration, planning, that those who had acknowledged the former 2 or identified with the former 2 statements were poorer on performance of all of these tests than those who aligned with the second 2 statements. And that was not just cross-sectionally, but longitudinally, and that was adjusted for, remember that big menu of factors I showed you we measured in TILDA, adjusted for all of that. So having a positive or negative attitude, even with these simple tools, independently influences factors that we know predict disability in later life, like walking speed, like memory, like concentration and planning. And furthermore, she also went on to show that if you're frail and have negative attitudes, you have worse mental abilities cross-sectionally and longer term than people who are not frail. But if you're frail and have a positive attitude, you have the same mental abilities as someone who's not frail. So even with health problems, attitude dominates. Now, that just shows her work with respect to walking speed and negative perceptions. And we posited at that time that, so something like perceptions are modifiable. There's something we can do something about. But negativity about aging and ageism is all around us. It's in our workplace, compulsory retirement. It's in media a lot, although I think getting better. And it's even amongst cohorts or in environments. We have to be terribly careful as a society that we're aware of ageism. It's the last ageism. It's the last ageism with, sexism and racism. There's a huge awareness, but this is something that still isn't out there and has a huge impact on something that's modifiable in terms of healthy lifespan. I'm very glad to say that mandatory retirement in the USA was abolished up to the age of 70 in 1978, and then outlawed altogether in 1986. And they were very clear that it was redefined as no automatic switch gears from work to non-work, that withdrawal from the workforce should be voluntary and whatever best suits the individual. In other words, accommodated, with part-time if that was most appropriate, if the organization could do that, etc. And this is important given that since 2012, the number of people over the age of 65 has significantly surpassed the numbers under the age of 12. So we need a continuing workforce to sustain our dropping numbers of younger cohorts in the population. So that's attitude. I think it's also great that something like friendship is important to our biology. We're gregarious animals, as are monkeys and many other animals. We need people. Now some of us need others to greater or lesser extent. No question about that. But fundamentally, we're a gregarious animal. And friendship matters. The Rosetta story that I'm sure you're familiar with now was the first to unmask this back in the 1940s and then published in JAMA in the 1960s. And the medical profession just didn't believe it at the time, that the strength of social relationships and the quality of social relationships could actually affect whether or not you got a heart attack early, whether or not you died from heart disease. But we know now that this is the case. And from this very large study correlating social relationships and death rates, they showed that of 148 research studies over 300,000 participants, there was a significantly higher likelihood in survival if you had strong social relationships. Remarkably, the risk was the same as smoking or alcohol excess or low physical activity or high cholesterol. We know that loneliness, particularly painful loneliness, is very bad for one's biology, particularly one's cardiovascular biology. So this is also potentially a modifiable risk factor for ensuring healthy lifespan. Again, at a societal level, but with each of us having individual responsibilities, not just for ourselves, because that's hard, but to ensure that others aren't experiencing loneliness. And part of the advantage of sharing and friendship is, of course, a problem shared. Now, you've all heard of problem shared is a problem halved, and can that be? And could that possibly be at a biological level? And again, very nice work from a group in San Francisco, which took psychology students, divided them into two groups, measured, again, baseline stress markers, be they the nervous system stress markers or hormone system stress markers, and then gave the whole class a debating topic which they had to debate about in front of the class. But they divided the class into two groups. One group was allowed to share what they were going to say and plan their debating together. The other group worked alone. The group who worked alone had significantly higher stress markers after the debate than those who had shared their problem. Really nicely tying this whole concept of sharing being a process by which we can dilute stress responses. So part of all of this is tied up with the difference between our chronological age, the number of candles on our birthday cake, and biological age, because all of these processes, stress, attitude, friendship, social engagement, social relationship, they all influence biology and our biological age. And we do know that there are a number of well-recognized hallmarks in each cell of aging, be they stem cell exhaustion or telomeres or intracellular communication slightly off, or dysregulated nutrient sensing, a big one, genomic instability, loss of proteosis, mitochondrial dysfunction, epigenetic alterations, they're the clocks. These are the hallmarks we know are present in cells that are aging. However, if we look at those various hallmarks and correlate them with chronological age here, that's a pretty good linear correlation, no matter which one we pick. But they are woefully poorly associated with each other. If telomere length and epigenetic aging were associated strongly, then we'd expect a relationship of almost 1 between the two. But they're not associated. So that's telling us that we have identified things in cells associated with aging, but we don't know the direction of causality, and we don't know which of them matters, and is there something else that underpins all of these factors that's causing these particular cellular changes individually. But no one cell change is the cause of aging. And in that context, I would urge you to retain a healthy cynicism regarding claims which are out there now that we have cracked aging. We are really, really accelerating our information on aging, and the area has exploded in that context over the last couple of decades. But we've some way to go yet before we have a solution and clearly understand the cause of the aging process, and even potentially the factors we can use to modify it. One interesting area, which all of those hallmarks of aging feed into and are related to, is oxidative stress. And you'll have heard about antioxidants, which fight oxidative stress. And we do know that long-lived animals like there's the Antarctic sponge, which lives to 1,500 years, or the bowhead whale, which lives to over 200, or this lovely old Galapagos turtle, which lived to 175 and only died because he got a crack in his shell and it became infected. So what we do know with those long-lived animals is that there are genetic mutations which make them resistant to oxidative stress. And I'm going to focus a little bit on oxidative stress because it's important in terms of the core understanding of what happens to us biologically and how all of the factors we're going to mention that we can influence when aging affect the cell. So antioxidants are molecules that fight free radicals in our body, and free radicals are what are released from energy production in the body, but they can become harmful if they get too high in a cell. Let me give you a really good analogy of all of this. And a really good analogy of all of this is the washing machine. So all of our cells, all they're about is producing energy. My eye cells are producing energy. My heart cells are producing energy. My liver cells, my skin cells, my gut cells, my head cells are producing most energy now because I'm concentrating on what to say to you. All of our cells are producing energy. We take food in, we take air in, it works together in a cell to produce energy. It's just like putting clothes into a washing machine. The clean water comes in and it washes the clothes, and the clothes are there for your energy pack finished. But dirty water is produced. And dirty water can't stay in the washing machine, or the washing machine will not continue to clean the clothes. It has to be gotten rid of. And that's exactly what happens to our cells. We take food in, we take oxygen in, energy is produced, but there are byproducts to energy production, which the cell has to get rid of very quickly. And it's that delicate balance between intake and output that is so critical to the biological aging process. And it's when that balance becomes out of sync that there's an accumulation of different factors, including free radicals, and that we see those hallmarks of aging taking place in a cell. And again, we struggle still with understanding the causal direction, although we know that oxidative stress is key to a number of the processes which lead to these hallmarks of aging. Now, we've learned an awful lot from identical twin studies, and this is some work by my colleague, who's newly appointed Associate Professor of Aging in the Life course in Trinity. Great approach, that aging and the life course, because aging just doesn't start at any particular age. It's present and accumulating throughout the life course. And we've studied, and others have studied, work on twins, identical twins, genetically the same twins because they're identical. But you can see here that one twin is a lot younger looking than the other twin. This twin is younger looking than that twin, and this twin is younger looking than that twin. This twin's skin is heavier, more lined, and he doesn't have the same lively look as this twin. And likewise, this twin's face looks older. And because of those identical twin studies, we can say that at the very best, only 30% of the aging process, of the lifespan process, is due to genes, probably 20%, but no more than that. The rest are modifiable environmental factors, like attitude, like friendship, as we've just discussed. Like not just relationships, but stress, being in nature, being outdoors, exercise, weight, purpose, all of these things are environmental factors which influence the aging process within a cell. They all function as antioxidants for the cell. And I just showed this because I think it's fantastic that those external environmental factors could actually be honing in at a cellular level on all of the different elements that we know are so important for keeping our cells ticking over at a fixed rate to produce energy and get rid of toxins. We grossly underestimate the value of moving naturally throughout the day. It's part of healthy aging at all ages. Walking, gardening, housework. And one of the first times we learned this was through studies of the blue zone people. And the blue zones are in California, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Okinawa, Ikaria in Greece, Okinawa off the coast of Japan. There are 5 zones in the world which were first identified to have an excess number or proportion of centenarians. And they just didn't have many more people over the age 90 and 100 than other countries, even off their coast. But they were living much healthier lives. And through studying those blue zones, we've been able to learn some of the factors that we can modify as part of the aging process. Having a purpose in life matters. Knowing why you wake up in the morning makes you healthier, happier, and can add up to 7 years of extra life expectancy. And one way or another, remaining active and working into the 80s and 90s, whatever sort of work that be. All of these areas, despite the fact that, look, they're so far apart from a global perspective, share also in common 80% satiation. They don't eat until they're full. And I'm going to come on to calorie restriction in that context and some nice rhesus monkey studies, which these 2 monkeys are age 20 when the photographs were taken. Now you can see this monkey here, I would put to you is a younger looking monkey. Its nostrils are the normal size, whereas this one is kind of retracted and big. It's got a drooped mouth, it's got less hair, dead eyes. This one looks a bit livelier, agitated. And indeed, this is them from the side. Remember, they're the same chronological age, the same number of candles on their birthdays. Okay, this monkey's lost hair, its posture is deflated, whereas this one is actually quite lively looking. In fact, looks like an offspring from this one, if anything. Same age. But this one had gone through lifelong 40% reduction in calorie intake, whereas this one had a standard diet all its life. And there's a lot of work to show that caloric restriction is of value. This is our typical diet in a 24-hour period or 48-hour period. So we eat and we get a peak in glucose, and we eat and a peak in glucose and a peak in glucose, bit of a break during the night, and then peak in glucose, peak in glucose, peak in glucose. No ketones. Now, what caloric restriction does is it switches the glycogen ketone clocks in our body. And some ketones in the context of calorie restriction are in fact good and where we want to be. In this diet, there was an 18-hour of fasting every day. So this was a fasting period. And after a while, ketones started coming up because there was that switch in the glycogen clocks, and then food, and there were a couple of glucose blips, and then fasting for 18 hours again, ketones started to rise, or this is another calorie restriction diet, 1 day fast, 1 day on, 1 day off, where the ketones started to rise after 12 o'clock, still no glucose, and then a glucose meal, ketones drop again, and we've got our glucose blips. So all of these are recommended diets, calorie restriction diets. And in the book, I've cited a number of different options because, one size doesn't fit all. Some people find they can't fast in the morning. The easiest one that I find is to eat within an 8-hour window and to start eating at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and just stick to that window. But, horses for courses. Lifelong, it's really difficult to adhere to calorie restriction, although there are some who are doing so and are very persuaded by it. So more and more we're developing caloric restriction mimics, which act at a cellular level the same as calorie restriction does. Resveratrol is one thing. It's a nutrient. You can buy it in health food stores. Polyphenol, also found in strawberries and prunes and a number of other fruits. Metformin is a really, really interesting product. It's been a type 2 diabetic medication for a number of years now. And there are 2 ongoing trials to actually assess its value in extending healthy lifespan, MILES and TAME trials. And the concept came from observational studies where it was noted in large epidemiological data sets that diabetics who were on metformin compared to diabetics who were on another anti-diabetic drug, when adjusted for all the other confounders that might have influenced long life, the diabetics on the metformin were living longer and they were living healthier lives and didn't seem to get as much heart disease. So that spawned a lot of animal work and in vitro work studying the effect of metformin at a cellular level, and found indeed that metformin influenced a number of these hallmarks of aging we find in cells. And now clinical trials are ongoing in the States, following up clinical cohorts who are taking metformin regularly or not, to see if it makes any difference to fixed outcomes, including disability and frailty. Quercetin is another kind of polyphenol type caloric restriction mimic, as is quercetin and rapamycin, which works at mTOR level, which is much more about dysregulated nutrient sensing pathways, also very important in the aging process. And we use this also in oncology to assist with cell functioning during chemotherapy. Nearly all of the studies which have looked at longevity and associated longevity with diet have found that the studies, the populations use plant-based diets predominantly, which are low in sugar, low in salt, low in refined grains, and lots of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, pulses, and beans, the cornerstone of most of these diets. And in Okinawa, they have a lovely proverb: eat something from the land and something from the sea every day. And again, most of the long-lived cohorts would not be frequent red meat eaters. And the Okinawans also eat a lot of turmeric and garlic. It's impossible to say very clearly, definitively, which diet is best, but pretty much Mediterranean diets with fish, some white meat, little red meat, consistently show best outcomes in big studies. This is a lovely recent Japanese study where they took a series of people aged 40 to 70, representative sample of 100,000 in Japan, and looked at their diet and other modifiable factors in middle-aged, followed them up for 8 years, and asked what effect do frequently taking or regularly taking or embarking in these 8 modifiable lifestyle factors, what difference does that make to overall lifespan and heart disease lifespan? And the 8 factors were lots of fish, fruit, milk, walking or sports participation, low body mass index, that means not overweight or obese, not smokers, not a lot of alcohol consumption, and not binge drinking, and a good sleep duration. And they found that adopting those 8 modifiable lifestyle factors significantly improved longevity. Even after the age of 85, it continued to influence longer, healthy lifespan. We certainly underestimate the importance of sleep. And the problem is that as we get older, sleep becomes slightly more disrupted and our patterns of sleep definitely change. Some of the things which can help with sleep are foods or beverages that contain epigenin, or maybe omega oils or vitamin D or tryptophan. Actually, a lovely experiment in men showing that men who had salmon 3 times a week before bedtime slept significantly better than the control group, who were controlled for all other factors but did not have salmon. So there is something in tryptophan, vitamin D, omega oils, and epigenin which will help with sleep. And in the book, I've listed a number of foods and drinks full of these, but also foods and drinks to avoid, tyramine and caffeine particularly. Did you know that Italian Chianti wine is high in tyramine and can affect sleep in some of us? And blue light is really bad for sleep. We've evolved through centuries to exposure to yellow light. Blue light is only very recent exposure for humans. And this was a lovely experiment actually in young 20-year-olds, which showed that these are the different games. This is sleep duration and hours of screen use. So the higher the hours of screen use, the less the sleep duration. And the biggest culprits were email and online chat, PC games, and to a lesser extent, console games. So blue light, late at night, or for a long duration during the day affects sleep. And our recommendation isn't to try not to expose yourself to blue light for an hour before bed. And to downshift is important. Most long-lived cultures, particularly in the blue zones, they all have their own rituals for de-stressing. Built into their day, the Adventists pray. The Icarians take a nap. The Sardinians do happy hour every day. with friends and some wine. And gardening is also de-stressing. Another lovely experiment, which again took 2 cohorts of people, measured all of their stress-related neural function and cortisols, and then one group gardened and the other group read indoors. Now, then they were exposed to a stress test, and both of them had attenuation of the response to stress than if they hadn't done gardening or hadn't done reading, but gardening superseded reading. So in other words, the modification of the stress response was much more marked in those who had gardened than in those who had read. Now, we've been looking for centuries for the elixir of youth, and I've shared some tidbits that might help you discover your own personal elixir, things that you've got control over. The Tang dynasty, between 618 and 907, had 22 emperors. And it was probably one of the most cultured periods in Chinese history. And yet, 6 of the 22 emperors died from self-poisoning, from concoctions which were made up by their alchemists, believed to enable longer, healthier life, or even eternal life. Mercury, cinnabar, gold, and sulfur, highly toxic. And this was one of the excerpts, a translation from Needham and Liu. After taking an elixir, if your face and body itch as though insects are crawling all over them, if your hands and feet swell, if you can't stand the smell of food, bring it up. If you feel as though you're going to be sick most of the time, if you experience weakness of 4 limbs, if you can't go to the toilet, if your head or stomach ache, don't be alarmed or disturbed. All these effects are proof that the elixir, this was clearly written by one of the alchemists, you are taking is successfully dispelling your latent disorders. I think we've more sense now than to believe something like that, although it took 300 years for this very sophisticated society to cop on. But we do have today a lot of investment, activity, and enthusiasm for the elixir of eternal life. Silicon Valley's billionaires want to hack the aging process. Getting and betting on anti-aging research, hoping for a cure for aging. Plowing a fortune into tech to keep them ticking. I think we're some way off that now. However, I also believe that we have a number of simple, fun solutions that we can employ, that I've shared, I hope, which will make a difference to our quality of life and healthy lifespan. This is the book that they very kindly shared earlier on. And I wrote this because I was doing a lecture tour, sharing all of the TILDA studies, because we've published over 600 research papers, to rural Ireland. So in collaboration with the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, we were visiting each county and giving a lecture on what individuals could do to enhance the aging experience at all ages, starting at age 20 and upwards. And so many people said after the lectures, have you written this down somewhere? There's just too much information there. I need to read it. So hence age proof. Thank you. So there's a couple of questions which have come in here, which I'm going to go through now. Is that all right, Megan?
Yep, please do. You might want to just stop sharing your screen so we don't see the end of the slideshow.
Yeah. I've stopped sharing now. Is that all right?
fire away with the questions.
So, would you encourage clinical and community services to use creative therapies like music and art for individuals for positive aging, psychological support and well-being? So there's a very good literature, thank you, that's from Alexandra Owens. There's a very good literature on this actually, showing that creativity does impact positively on biological aging. It may be a composite of another number of factors. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the reasons are. It doesn't matter what it's a composite for or from. Its social engagement is often happens during creative activity. Creativity in itself is a very positive psychological expression, and attitude can change if you produce something. And you gain more self-esteem and positivity from it. So I think creativity is very important, and indeed it's one of the mechanisms that's not uncommonly used by people when they retire or otherwise to continue purpose in life after retirement. Hi, I was wondering, what are your views on the digital divide and the importance of technology to improve social inclusion? So I think that the digital world has an awful lot to offer in terms of social inclusion. However, we also have to be careful because it can also exclude and marginalize. If people find that the technology requirements are with their competencies, they can feel very marginalized. Also, if you have grown up and become used to a face-to-face confrontation or engagement for services, for example, the bank, for example, and then you're confronted with nothing but technological access that frustrates you, that can be very frustrating and as I say, very isolating and marginalizing. So of course technologies play a role, but I would say that corporates should look at a hybrid model, which mightn't just be suitable for older persons. Maybe there are many others who would actually prefer a human encounter, face-to-face encounter, as well as technology. When you talk about caloric restriction for the whole of lifespan, does that start in childhood? As a parent, it feels counterintuitive. Yeah. So this is the point. We don't know about whether at a human level those studies should start in childhood. The rhesus monkey study started from get-go, from birth. But it's not. I have no evidence to say yes it should or no it shouldn't start from childhood. I think that certainly in early midlife there are gains from caloric restriction, and you know almost half of the population in Ireland over the age of 50 are either overweight or obese. And it's a whole talk in itself, the toxicity to our system, to our immune systems and cardiovascular systems, obviously, kidney systems of white fat. And yes, I know breakfast is the most important meal of the day. That's why I'm saying that I think that's so for children. And I think that, you have to play it by ear. A really good little rule of thumb is eat within an 8-hour window. And kids can and should probably do that all of the time with their sleeping patterns. What is the relative impact that can be achieved by adopting some of those recommendations on successful aging in our 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s? I was going to show a slide and I should have brought it with me, a fabulous study from the University of Bergen, just published in the last couple of weeks from PLOS ONE. And they answered exactly that question. They did a big meta-analysis of all of the dietary data that's available. And then they applied different models to that data. And they divided the diets into typical Western diet, burgers, tomato sauce, whatever. A the optimum diet that I've shared with you, predominantly plant with fish, it's plant-based with fish, etc. And then they did a diet in the middle, a feasibility one, which, in truth is the one that most of us will probably find, easiest to take. And they showed actually that if you start the feasibility or the optimum one at age 20, you can add 8 and 10 years respectively to lifespan. If you started at age 40, you can still impact something like 4 and 5 years. Even if you started at age 60, there was a difference of 3 and 4 years to just doing the Western diet, starting at age 60. And if you start at age 80, you can still influence it by something like 1.5 and 2 years. Lovely stuff. So that's why I started off by saying the earlier the better, but it's never too late. We even know this in say, patients or residents in nursing homes. If you start exercise programs in nursing homes, it makes a big difference to a number of the physiological measures that we can measure, rather than doing very little or no exercise. Even in people who are already frail, exercise programs makes a difference, as does diet. Really enjoyed your book, and in particular the section on loneliness, which is a growing problem. Have you examples of positive ways in which this can be tackled? This is a terrible problem. And I find this really difficult. And it shouldn't be, and there should be easy solutions. But, if you, as I have worked all your life, you suddenly decide, okay, I'm giving up. And you've done, as I have done, very little in the way of other hobbies or social engagement or anything like that, and you stop. Then how do you start to build networks? How do you start to engage with people, etc.? It's very, very challenging. Compounded by, if you're kind of housebound or not able to get out, etc., for whatever reason, very challenging. Terribly important, should be modifiable, and something that I'd really love to see a citizens' assembly on in Ireland, how we can ensure that nobody in Ireland is ever lonely or socially isolated. And that we can offer a menu of choices to people in different areas. Now, University of the Third Age, for example, is a fabulous organization which offers this. It offers intellectual stimulation in addition to engagement. On Kashka, there are organizations, but it would be great just to see a menu of what they are, who and what they are in your area, and then offer people choices. But it is a problem. And I'm sure all of you are listening, thinking, gosh, I know someone who I think they must be lonely. So we have a responsibility, I think, also to reach out. Does caloric control need to be 18 hours? No. It doesn't have to be an 18-hour fast. Fast is good. As long as you feel a little bit ketotic. That kind of, the ketotic feeling is kind of a little bit of an acid feel or a sour taste in your mouth. That's ketotic. That's the purpose. Colin Brown, super, and thanks a million. All things are in moderation. Would you agree with that? I would. Oh, can you explain why women live longer? Well, it's interesting. Women do live longer, although in the recent life tables, that gap is narrowing. Purportedly, we live longer because of hormone differences. Estrogens are protective against cardiovascular disease, less stress, believe it or not. But as women are more and more in the workforce, working later, etc., globally, less likely to drink heavily, and smoke. And that particularly applies to countries with Russia, which have a very poor life expectancy, etc. But it's mostly hormones and stress. Do you recommend resveratrol? Yes, I do recommend resveratrol. Actually, you can get it in health food stores. It's not toxic. It's very hard to get a lot of as much. It's hard to take in as much resveratrol as were done in the experiments, which was 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams a day. I mean, I think a bottle of wine is 15 milligrams, so you'd want to go through a fair bit of wine to get enough. So I take resveratrol supplements myself, for example. I do recommend resveratrol. To what extent do you think global public health crisis, such as COVID, may have on life expansion? Well, great question. The first number of elements that I addressed actually are all relative to that. Attitude. People over the age of 70 were more or less told to stay in. And the unwritten implication there is, because society doesn't need you, you've hit 70, therefore we can do without you in the COVID crisis. At least that's how some people may well have interpreted it. So I was very much against that policy decision. That's the first thing. Secondly, social isolation. Thirdly, I can't tell you how soul destroying it was that patients who were dying or patients who were very ill were on their own in terms of not having a family structure around them, family support, family with them. And I know of families who experienced that where a death occurred, they weren't there, and the guilt and the repercussions are huge. So I think that we will see fallout from that. We did do a TILDA COVID wave and found that depression and loneliness were threefold higher than the wave of TILDA we had done just pre-COVID. Blohi Nigaler, in the Netherlands, they promote intergenerational house sharing. Love that. Okay. Yes, you're absolutely right. Respect, intergenerational respect, intergenerational house sharing, and having friends from different age groups. We're really bad on these islands, and indeed in Europe, for having friends from different age groups, younger and older, really bad. We stick to a very tight peer group. We've so much more to learn beyond that. Germans are a bit better, Portuguese are very good, Italians are very good, etc. So intergenerational houses make a huge difference to happiness and quality of life and lack of loneliness and social isolation in a home. There's also a lot of shared wisdom passed on. But we can apply that also to friendships. Your dad said, eat as much as you can up to 40 and as little as you can after 40. Okay, I go with that, I suppose. Des Kelly. We've heard that COVID can shrink the brain. Yeah, there is new work actually showing, preliminary work, that the number of gray matter volume in some people who have long COVID with foggy brains experienced afterwards. So yeah, I mean, I would say about that, watch this space. It's a nice question to say, do we know, does this affect other infections? I run in my day job, I'm in the hospital now, I run a cardiovascular clinic for syncope, blackouts and falls and that sort of thing. And I see a lot of people who are having symptoms after standing, which last for a long time, just autonomic dysfunction after, this is pre-COVID, after a viral infection, didn't even have to be a bad viral infection. And the symptoms actually transpires are exactly the same as we're now seeing with COVID. But I don't know the answer to your question to see if they also influence MRI function. Don't know. So I think Megan wants to wrap.
Thanks very much, Rosanna. We've actually reached the end of our hour. And we'd just like to say thank you very much for all your time and giving us such an enlightening and inspiring talk and sharing your insights and advice. I know I was jotting down all sorts of things and I really must think about that, consider that, take that off the dietary list. So it was really, there's a lot of practical advice that we can take away, which is always really helpful. I'd also like to thank my colleagues here at Trinity Development and alumni for their support in bringing this webinar together, particularly Sonia Perkins and Mark Deering. And of course, all of you for joining us here today, to taking time out of your afternoon to spend it with us and learn a little bit to continue your learning. Now, we will be holding another webinar at the end of April. It will air live on Wednesday, the 27th. We will be joined by Trinity alumna and award-winning author Louise Nealon, whose novel Snowflake was published to acclaim in May of last year. She will be interviewed by Dr. Margaret Robson of Trinity School of English, and we're looking forward to a really interesting conversation about her process, about what it meant to be a Trinity grad as a writer, and all sorts of interesting things. Details on how to register for the next webinar will be included in our follow-up email to today's webinar. If you have any questions or comments regarding this webinar series, or any other questions you'd like to ask us generally here in the alumni office, please email us at alumni@tcd.ie. Thank you again for joining us, and until next time, please take care.